Howdy Carp, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, Masterclass member asked me to explain what causes the phenomenon known as bubble gut with bodybuilders. It's a controversial subject. Anybody that follows the high end of professional bodybuilding, at least today, you don't so much see this in local amateur ranks, but certainly in the elite levels of bodybuilding, where you have the mass monsters, this phenomenon known as bubble gut raises a degree of controversy. You could say people are either put off by it in such a profound way that they kind of express that they no longer have an interest in bodybuilding, which I think is, to be honest with you, an overreaction. Yes, I will agree that at the very high end of this game, at the guys that are walking on stage at 270, 280 pounds plus, that this is an issue today, and it's a valid topic we're going to talk about today. But quite bluntly, I'm not sure why that would put someone off of the sport of bodybuilding in total, because it represents such a small percentage or such a small proportion of the total number of athletes that participate in our sport on an amateur and a professional level. You're really talking about a small subset of the total number of athletes that are inflicted by this. Let's call it a condition, and I'm going to explain what causes the condition, what's the underlying cause of the condition in today's video. So let's get started with today's video. What causes bubble gut? So let me just give a little bit of background here to guys that I'm sure everybody kind of knows what we mean by bubble gut, but let me give a bit of background, because a lot of people might be surprised by some of the stuff that I'm going to present here. It might not be the regular, and I hope it's not the regular run-of-the-mill stuff that you see on bodybuilding type websites. So let me first basically explain that there's been, as I said, a raised awareness, I suppose is a good word to describe it, of this issue in bodybuilding, and it's so often referred to as a problem with bodybuilding today, quote unquote, or modern bodybuilders experience this problem. But I'm gonna challenge that. I don't agree that's necessarily true. So let's basically start with understanding that there are many reasons. It's multifactorial, the cause of bubble gut. But I think before we start getting into these causes, I just want to point out a couple of things that I think are really important here. And that is, this is not a terribly new phenomenon. If you don't know who this man is, this is Victor Richards. And Victor Richards was a 1990s bodybuilder. He was famous for not competing, basically. He had a tremendous following and tremendous amount of exposure. But my point being is, if you look at these photographs of Victor Richards, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I'm just trying to be honest here. The photographs on the right hand side of the page in his posing trunks, the color photographs, show what we tend to associate with a 1990s style bodybuilder. Great mass, nice symmetry, nice proportion. But look at that photograph on the left. That's what you would call, quote unquote, bubble gut, in my opinion. That's a bubble gut, right? So this idea that this is a modern phenomenon, I just don't quite understand why guys get that. Yes, you didn't used to see those photographs back then. That I will agree with. That I agree with. In the 1990s, before social media, before the quote unquote internet, you didn't see those photographs, all right? Because what happened was the nature of print magazines and the people that controlled that, they didn't want to show you those things. That didn't mean that those guys didn't look that way at times, all right? But when you bought Flex magazine or when you bought Muscular Development, they didn't want to show their paid athletes in that light. And so they, it's like modeling. I don't know whether guys have ever dated a model or not, but like when you look at modeling photographs, from 100 photographs, 99 of them end up on the cutting room floor. They don't make it to print. That's how things used to be in this day of social media, in this day of Instagram and Facebook and things like that, where photographs are effectively free to take and to publish, things have changed. And so, and you see this look being presented regularly today. Agreed. Now, I don't agree. If you look at that photograph, that guy, and I'm just going to show you another picture here of him lined up against Phil Heath. I don't believe that those two photographs are significantly different from each other. All right, I think they're close enough to be able to say, look, this was an issue that's been with us since at least the 90s. That's more than 30 years. All right. In fact, I'm gonna challenge even further than that. The first big controversy, the first big fuss that I ever remember as an amateur bodybuilder about this issue of what we call, let's call this gut control here for this segment, was actually Frank Zane, believe it or not. In the early 1980s, Frank Zane, right, caused a huge amount of controversy with turning up to the Olympia and going through a posing routine with a distinct lack of what you would call stomach control, okay, midsection control. Now, before the Frank Zane fucking fan club jump on this bandwagon, hear me out here. These are three separate photographs from three separate angles taken during the same posing routine where his gut's hanging out. Okay? Three separate photos, three separate angles, same posing routine. That to me is like, like you're starting to get into what I would call midsection control problems. And this, I remember when all these conversations were happening. People were complaining about the way he presented himself on stage. He didn't look how he should look as Frank Zane. So my point being here, before we get into the discussion of what causes this, is I think it is a mistake for guys to be referencing this issue, this issue of midsection control, if we want to call it that, rather than call it bubble gut, midsection control, as something that is about modern bodybuilding. All right, I think I remember fragments of this, from when I started training 30 years ago. 30 years ago, all right. This is not, a consequence of the last 5 years or 10 years of bodybuilding. All right, this has been an issue that has been building. I will agree that it's getting worse. That I agree upon. But it started with Frank Zane. All right, there were issues with Dorian Yates at one point. There were issues with, as I said, Victor Richards. There have always been individuals that this commentary has revolved around midsection control. Is it getting worse? I will concede that point. So basically what we need to talk about is then potentially is, what are the underlying issues? What are the potential causes of this? And I want to run through, the multifactorial causes, let's call it, of bubble gut. Most people today who are not bodybuilders, right, want to blame what I call the overuse of drugs. They basically refer to as HGH gut or IGF gut. That's what they refer to it as. It's like, the amount of drugs today is causing this phenomenon. Is it true that the use of performance-enhancing compounds causes an increase in organ size and organ weight? Yeah. We have enough evidence to support that concept. Yes, it's fair to say yes. Right. This is a study that's basically done on surrogates. Surprise, surprise, because we have to kill them and weigh their organs, right? That basically does show a relationship, a correlation between the use of human growth hormone and the resultant increase in IGF levels and increase in organ weights in that surrogate class in rats. And there is enough evidence, as I said, in human beings to look at that and say, look, it's plausible, absolutely. And so therefore I would concede that you could put this down as a contributing factor. I don't have any problem with that at all. So let's concede that point, that potentially that the combination of high dose anabolic steroids, high dose human growth hormone, potentially insulin, the synergistic nature of all these sorts of things is all contributing in some measurable way to this problem. I will concede that point. However, what I also think we need to do is we kind of need to go through and look at some of the other evidence that we have to support this. There is some evidence looking at the use of human growth hormone with the application towards decreasing visceral body fat, right? And so this is an interesting thing. It's like a double-edged sword. You can't really just point your finger at HGH. You have to look at it in more of in a somewhat more granular level. So the combination of drugs together, potentially, yes. As always, the dose, yes. I think that it's fair to say that in all of the content that I create, you'll hear this recurring theme that talks about dose dependency, dose dependency, dose dependency. The dose matters here. So I don't think it's fair for us to look at growth hormone use in a blanket way and say that's what's causing it, because on the flip side of the table, we have a degree of evidence that actually supports the use of human growth hormone with the treatment of obese conditions that don't directly point to like any issues with abnormal organ development. Period. Right. So if this was a plausible discussion, you're talking about what I would call abusive doses, which are very expensive too, I should point out. So let me get on to the main reason I wanted to make this video, because this is the point that I think that most guys don't understand. This is the silver bullet point in this video, that is understanding that yes, there are many factors potentially that contribute to this issue of the bubble gut, as it were, right? But I think it's important to understand that there's actually evidence to support the idea that you are going to see an increase in organ size through weight training, all right, regardless of whether you use steroids or not. Right? A lot of people don't understand that. A lot of people think, oh, my organs are my organs. They're not going to change. And the reality is that they are going to change, whether you expose yourselves to performance-enhancing drugs or not. So I'm not dismissing performance-enhancing drugs here. I'm saying that could potentially be certainly a factor here, but understand this factor here. This is a study that was done in Japan where they basically looked at healthy young men. No reason to suggest that they were using steroids. Yes, these were athletes, agreed. And as I said, you can see here there's an age between 18 and 20 years, so like a 2-year kind of time frame, where they basically looked at athletes that were considered to be freshmen and seniors, and looked at their increases in lean muscle mass. And again, these were football players, so athletes, not healthy young men, but power athletes, let's call them. And over that time frame, over that 2-year time frame between being freshmen and being seniors, these young men significantly increased body mass. And you can see here the average was an increase from 70 kilograms to 87 kilograms, which is a hell of a gain. 2 years. Good work. Kudos to them, right? But again, understand this is what you would call semi-professional sports. This is serious business, football here. Okay, so they went from 70 kilograms as freshmen to 87 kilograms. There was obviously an increase in lean body mass. There was obviously an increase in fat mass. But what a lot of guys don't know is that there was an increase in organ tissue mass as well. Okay, so when they looked at the different organs as you go through there, and you kind of see, okay, so there was a fairly significant increase over that 2-year time frame of organ weights in natural athletes that were aggressively pursuing this, what we call accumulation of body mass. Right? Here's the slide that I think is most relevant from this study, though, and that is what they actually did after noticing that was they set about trying to recreate that scenario. Okay, so over the course of a year, okay, they basically took a group of young men and tried to replicate that training in what we would call overfeeding, so a surplus of calories, overfeeding protocol. And they were, to a remarkable extent, able to replicate that. So they saw a very significant increase in total body mass. They saw an increase in body fat mass. and they saw an increase in tissue mass. Now, here's the important thing for guys to understand. Let me explain this. They saw a percentage change rate, right, in some of these organs, right, up to 18%. Okay, so between 6.5 and 18% increase in organ size in a single year in natural athletes. That's profound, right? 1 year of training, 1 year of forced overfeeding for that purpose of, you know, trying to create power athletes here, created between 6.5 and 18.5% increase in organ weights in a natural environment. Okay, so hopefully you can see where I'm going with here in this conversation. That is understanding that organ growth is going to happen if you go down this domain. It just is. The question is how much is going to happen. That's the question for you. Okay, so if you were to follow this model and say, look, I'm natural, I don't use any drugs, I'm gonna follow this forced feeding protocol, deliberately trying to grow quality tissue here, I can expect to see a not insignificant increase in my organ weights over the course of a year, right? Just by following the protocol, not insignificant, as I said, 18.6% in the heart, right? Okay, so the idea then that if you keep doing that, is it rational, is it reasonable, is it logical to believe that the following year you'll see an increase again? Yeah, why not? Why is it going to stop in the first year? Might it diminish? Sure, we don't really know whether it does or not, by what magnitude, but it's fair to assume that it's going to keep going. So you can see here the point being is you're going to experience quote unquote organ growth even if you're fucking natural, right? And the longer you do it, the bigger they're going to get, right? So hopefully guys can kind of have a little bit of insight into what my point is here, and that is it's not just the drugs, guys. It's not. This is multifactorial. Let me step through the things that influence quote unquote bubble gut. First is genetics, your structure. Guys who have very short torsos, right, tend to suffer from this more than guys with very long torsos. Guess what? They have a cavity. Everything needs to fit inside that cavity, and that cavity doesn't grow, right? Yes, your skeletal muscle mass grows. Yes, apparently your fucking organs grow, but the organs, don't fit in that cavity anymore the way they used to, is my point. Genetics plays a role here. The larger the cavity that you have for your organs to fit in, right, the less likely are you to have an apparent problem. So you have these guys walking around with this arrogant air of like, I don't have that problem, I don't have the problem, going, dude, it may well be genetics that are helping you here, right? So genetic structure, having the right genetic structure is going to help you here a little bit, or it could hinder you. If you're a very short, squat guy with a very short torso, and a lot of bodybuilders are, remember, that cavity is going to be, not helping you. Let's just say this. Then, natural organ growth. Doesn't matter whether you use the drugs or not, boys. Your organs are going to grow if you pursue this domain, right? It's just a question of by what magnitude do they grow. You can expect a significant increase in the first year of natural training, okay? And the next year, and no reason to suggest it's going to stop, right? Not entirely. Would it slow down? One would assume so. One would assume so. Hypertrophy of skeletal muscle mass slows down. Why wouldn't it on organ growth? To the point whereby it's it's a smaller dose, and then you start to introduce some of these other challenges, things like training age. I'm being honest here. I think guys who've been training longer have a problem here. If you look at a lot of these guys that have quote unquote bubble guts, they didn't have it when they were 20, but the older they get into their 30s and they get into their 40s, and they start to have problems. I think training age plays a role here. Now, why might that be? One, potentially, you've had many decades of natural organ growth, let alone the acceleration of that through the use of performance enhancing compounds. But potentially also, as you get older, you start to store fat viscerally. I do. At over 50, I store my fat, inside my belly now more than I used to. I can walk around with like veins in my biceps and have 25 pounds of body fat on my body, because that's how I store body fat now as an older man. I need to be mindful of that. So that, again, one more step in the process of not creating that less than desirable outlook or less than desirable visual look is visceral fat. Is visceral fat a potential contributor here? Sure, absolutely, right? Do drugs contribute here? Absolutely. I think anybody that doesn't appreciate that, natural organ growth happens, we know this, okay? Do drugs accelerate that process? Why wouldn't they, right? In a dose-dependent manner, why wouldn't they, right? So, do I think that drugs, testosterone, all anabolic steroids, I would say, all anabolic steroids, all human growth hormone, insulin, to some extent, are going to contribute here. Not massively so, but if you subscribe to the idea that you are going to, through the processes of your own, training and the eating protocols that we go through, experience a degree of natural organ growth, which is not insignificant, why wouldn't drugs exacerbate that? Why wouldn't they? I think it's fair to say they would, in a dose-dependent manner. And finally, what I would say is I think that overeating and the nutritional practices that we as bodybuilders practice, and I include myself in that, can lead to other issues like just too much food in the gut, inflammation, and a whole bunch of other factors, which is, again, just another factor here. So my point being, my overall takeaway here for you guys is basically this and that, is there isn't just one thing at play here. It's not just the drugs, okay? Not just the genetics either. It's all of these things, and some guys just get dealt a tough hand, as it were. They have less than ideal structure. They have been training for a very long time. They're potentially storing some visceral fat. They've been using too much drugs. Maybe they have poor eating habits with maybe they have food allergies. There's a certain degree of gut health issues that they have going on because of their nutritional planning practices and things like that. And it's one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and they end up in a position where it is a problem. Okay, so my overall comment would be the reason for the bubble gut is quote unquote the pursuit of mass. Right, that's what does it. It doesn't matter if you're trying to go from 70 kilos to 87 kilos in 2 years, right? And let's be honest, a lot of guys have that kind of aggressive goal in mind, right? It doesn't matter if you're Frank Zane, like at the end of his career, wanting to try and get bigger. And that's my opinion why he struggled that year, because it was like he was just trying too hard, right? Just trying too hard, right? He was entering that domain where the guys were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he just tried too hard. He came back the next year and he looked a whole lot better, right? Overall, the pursuit of mass is what causes the bubble gut, right? In a multifactorial sense. Now, what do you want to do about that? And here's the flip side to that coin. People say to me, so what can I do about that? You have to see what you can do to shave something off each of these potential points, in my opinion. Genetics, there's nothing you can do about that, right? Natural organ growth, nothing you can do about that, right? Training age, how are you going to deal with that? So you start to get into the areas that you can control. Visceral fat, you can control, right? The drugs that you choose to use, you can control. And your nutritional practices, you can control. Right? So some of these things we can't control, and some of these things we can, and so therefore you need to focus on the 3 or 4 things that you can control that are going to contribute in this space if you suffer from these issues. So that's my opinion about bubble gut. Sorry, no, I don't believe it's just the drugs. Okay, it's just not. This thing has been around for a much longer period of time than people understand, right? And it's been getting progressively worse. And the individuals that have the spotlight shined on them, as it were, as like examples of like how not to do this, tend to be the ones who at that point in their career are aggressively pursuing mass. Okay, so that's my opinion. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and I look forward to seeing you at the next Victor Black Masterclass. Sawadee Cup.